The circus arrived in the small town of Greenwood, and the residents eagerly awaited the evening show. The streets were buzzing with excitement. Children were laughing and talking loudly about the circus performers. Large, colorful tents appeared in the local square, and strange figures in costumes roamed the crowd, inviting everyone to the show. However, some older residents of the town said that this circus brought misfortune. They told stories of how a similar circus appeared in different towns, and after it left, people always disappeared. But the younger generation just laughed at these tales, thinking they were mere fabrications. The evening of the show came, and all the town's residents gathered under the big circus tent, waiting for the performance to begin. The lights dimmed, and bright spotlights illuminated the circus arena. Performers executed thrilling tricks, acrobats flew through the air, and clowns made the audience laugh. But with each act, the atmosphere in the tent grew more tense. People began to notice strange shadows flickering behind the curtains. The shadows moved independently of the performers, and their shapes were indistinct and frightening. A little girl sitting on her mother's lap pointed at one of these shadows and began to cry. The mother tried to calm her, but she too felt a cold terror. After the show ended, everyone went home, but anxiety remained in many hearts. That night, the town fell into silence, but it was a sinister silence. The first to disappear were those who lived closest to the circus grounds. One by one, people began to vanish without a trace, and by morning their homes were empty. Those who survived claimed to have seen strange shadows wandering the streets, whispering incomprehensible words. Some even said they heard circus music in the middle of the night, even though all the tents were locked and empty. The town sheriff, Jackson, tried to calm the people and began an investigation, but no trace of the missing was found. The next night, Jackson decided to go to the circus grounds himself and check if everything was in order. He took a lantern and headed through the darkness towards the large, colorful tents. As he approached, he felt a strange chill and noticed that all the tent doors were open. Inside, there was no one, just remnants of props and costumes that looked like the performers had left in a hurry. Jackson went further and found the large central tent. Entering inside, he saw that the arena was covered in dust, and scattered programs of the show lay on the seats. But the most terrifying sight was a huge shadow on the arena, which began to move towards him. The shadow approached, and Jackson felt panic overtaking him. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move, as if paralyzed by fear. The shadow rose above him, and he felt a cold breath on his neck. With his last bit of strength, he broke free and ran back to the town. But the shadows followed him, whispering eerie words he couldn't understand. When he reached the town, he saw that the shadows were already there, wandering the streets and entering houses. People screamed and tried to escape, but no one could evade these horrifying creatures. Jackson decided to gather the remaining residents and hide in the church, hoping that the holy place would protect them from the sinister shadows. They locked the doors and prayed to survive until morning. But the shadows were relentless. They penetrated through the walls and whispered in their ears, inducing unspeakable terror. People began to disappear right before their eyes, as if being pulled into another dimension. Jackson tried to fight, but felt his strength leaving him. He realized it was the end, and with his last prayer on his lips, he vanished into the darkness along with the others. The next morning, the town of Greenwood was empty. Not a soul remained, and only a sinister silence reigned. The circus disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. No one knew where all the people had gone, and only the old legends of the cursed circus remained as a warning to other towns. This story was passed down from generation to generation, reminding everyone that old warnings should not be ignored. For those who disregard the past may become its next victims. Barely breathing from fear, Jackson returned to the town and saw the shadows had already infiltrated the residents' homes. He felt the cold breath following him at every step. Immediately deciding that the church might be their last hope, he began gathering people, shouting about the danger and urging them to run to the holy place. On the way, he saw shadows pulling residents into the darkness, feeling hopelessness engulfing his soul. People rushed to the church in terror, trying to save their lives, but not everyone made it. Jackson, along with the survivors, locked the church doors and began to pray, hoping that the sanctity of the place would protect them from the sinister shadows. The silence was broken only by muffled sobs and whispered prayers. It seemed that time had stopped. Every sound outside made them flinch, but the whispers that began to penetrate the church were the most terrifying. Shadows appeared on the walls, their indistinct forms sliding over the stone blocks as if searching for a way to the people. Children clung to their parents, and adults tried to stay calm, but the fear was too strong. Jackson felt his own faith waning, but he knew he couldn't give up. He tried to find a way to fight the shadows, but everything seemed hopeless. They were omnipresent, elusive, and relentless. Finally, the shadows found a way into the church. They began to seep through the walls and floor, entwining people with their cold touch. Everyone touched by a shadow froze in place, as if petrified by terror. People disappeared one by one, their screams drowned out by eerie whispers. Jackson tried to fight, waving his lantern around, but the light couldn't stop the shadows. They moved like liquid, enveloping everything in their path. Eventually, Jackson was the only one left alive in the church, surrounded by shadows whispering his name. He felt his strength leaving him and realized this was the end. With his last prayer on his lips, he fell to his knees, watching as the shadows closed in around him. They came closer and closer, their cold touch making his heart clench with terror. At that moment, he understood that their goal was not just to destroy, but to consume his soul. The last thing he saw was the dark, empty eyes of the shadows watching him before everything went black. His screams were silenced by the shadows, and no one heard him again. The next morning, the town of Greenwood was completely empty. Not a soul remained, and only a sinister silence prevailed. The circus had disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. No one knew where all the people had gone, and only the old legends of the cursed circus remained as a warning to other towns. Some travelers passing through Greenwood claimed to hear whispers in the air and saw shadows wandering the streets, but no one dared to stay there overnight. Over time, the legend of the cursed circus was passed down from generation to generation, and even in neighboring towns, people knew about the terrible events in Greenwood. People feared circuses and avoided them, but old legends warned that the circus could appear again anywhere, and those who ignore the past may become its next victims. This story served as a reminder that not everything that seems fun and innocent is truly so. For behind the bright tents and clown laughter may hide unspeakable horror. One day, many years after Greenwood's disappearance, a new circus appeared in a neighboring town. The residents were again delighted with the news of its arrival, but the elders remembered the legend and warned the youth about the danger. But the young people, as before, laughed at the old tales and prepared for fun. And when the evening of the show arrived, they gathered under the big circus tent, waiting for the performance to begin. But this time, they didn't know that the shadows from Greenwood had returned, and only time would tell who would become their next victim. The Magic Marionettes Circus arrived in the small town of Riverview and gathered a crowd of curious residents. Known for its realistic dolls, the circus always amazed and fascinated the audience. The dolls were so masterfully made that they seemed alive. But this time, something went wrong. During the performance, one of the dolls suddenly began to move on its own, its movements smooth and natural, as if it were a living person. The audience was impressed, thinking it was part of the show, but the performers on stage looked frightened. After the performance, there was talk backstage that the doll had gone out of control. The circus director, Mr. Dupre, gathered all the performers and began an investigation. It turned out that this doll belonged to the puppet master, who had long been considered missing. The puppet master's dolls were always the most realistic, but no one knew how he achieved such a level of craftsmanship. After his disappearance, the dolls remained in the circus, and no one dared to use them in performances. But this time, the doll had come onto the stage by itself, and it frightened everyone. Mr. Dupre decided to destroy the doll, but when he tried to do so, the doll began to resist. It broke free from his hands and fled into a dark corner of the tent. The performers began to panic, and Mr. Dupre tried to calm them, but he felt on the verge of hysteria himself. The doll seemed alive, its eyes gleamed in the darkness, and it seemed to be watching their every move. No one knew what to do, so they decided to leave it in the tent until morning. But the night brought new horrors. The performers who stayed overnight at the circus heard strange sounds and screams coming from the tent with the doll. They gathered together and decided to go see what was happening. When they entered the tent, they saw the doll standing in the middle of the stage, moving as if performing its act. Its movements were smooth and elegant, but its eyes expressed horror and pain. Mr. Dupre realized that this was not just a doll, but something more. He approached it and tried to touch it, but at that moment, the doll grabbed his hand and whispered his name. He felt his blood freeze in his veins and realized that the doll contained the soul of the puppet master. Mr. Dupre remembered old legends about how the master used magic to imprison people's souls in his creations. The performers began to retreat, but the doll would not let go of Mr. Dupre. It continued to whisper his name and tell him about the horrors it had experienced. It said that all the dolls in the circus contained the souls of former performers whom the master had used for his creations. They were doomed to eternally perform their acts without the possibility of finding peace. Mr. Dupre was shocked and didn't know what to do. The doll asked him to help free their souls, but he didn't know how to do it. He agreed that they needed to find a way to free them, but he didn't know where to start. They decided to return to the old workshop where the puppet master had worked, hoping to find clues there. The workshop had been abandoned for many years, and an eerie silence prevailed inside. They found old records and books that told of magical rituals and spells. Mr. Dupre realized that to free the souls, they needed to perform a complex ritual, but it required great knowledge and courage. They decided to try because there was no other way. The performers gathered all the necessary ingredients and began preparing for the ritual. Night was approaching, and they knew they had little time left. The dolls began showing signs of life, and their movements became increasingly aggressive. Mr. Dupre and his team gathered in a circle, started reading the incantations and performing the ritual actions. The dolls surrounded them, appearing ready to attack at any moment. But as the ritual neared completion, something strange happened. The dolls began to freeze in place, their eyes dimmed, and they fell to the floor. The souls of the performers were freed, and they found peace. But the joy was short-lived. During the ritual, Mr. Dupre made a mistake, and instead of freeing the souls, he opened a portal to the shadow world. The shadows began to infiltrate our world, and everything they touched turned to darkness. The performers tried to fight, but the shadows were too strong. Mr. Dupre realized what he had done and tried to close the portal, but it was too late. The shadows consumed him and everyone around him. The magic marionette circus disappeared without a trace, and no one heard of it again. Only the legend of the puppet master who played with people's souls remained as a warning. As the dolls began to freeze, Mr. Dupre and his team felt relief, but it was short-lived. The shadows emerging from the portal quickly began to fill the tent. They moved like liquid, enveloping everything in their path, and it seemed nothing could stop them. The performers who remained in the tent screamed in terror and tried to flee, but the shadows were too fast. Mr. Dupre realized that his mistake had opened the gates to another world, and now they were all in danger. He tried to recall the spell to close the portal, but his mind was paralyzed with fear. The shadows continued to spread, and he saw them dragging his friends into the darkness. Desperately searching for a way to save his friends and himself, Mr. Dupre remembered the old magic book they had found in the workshop. He rushed to the table where the book lay, but the shadows had already begun to pull at his legs. He struggled with all his might to reach the book, while a terrible cold enveloped his body. With great effort, he broke free from the shadows and grabbed the book, hoping to find a saving spell. But when he opened it, the pages were blank. The shadows continued to approach, and he realized that the only way to close the portal was to sacrifice himself. Mr. Dupre understood that if he entered the portal, he could stop the shadows and save his friends. He looked at his colleagues who were barely standing from fear and realized this was his last chance. Gathering all his courage, he stood up and rushed toward the portal to enter it. The shadows, sensing his intention, tried to stop him, wrapping around his arms and legs, but he kept moving forward. As he neared the portal, he felt an overwhelming cold envelop his body, and his strength gradually left him. But he knew this was the only way to stop the horror. As he entered the portal, the shadows around him suddenly stopped. He felt himself being pulled into another world, but along with him, the shadows were drawn back into the darkness. All the terrifying creatures that had emerged from the portal were returning to the abyss. He saw his friends watching in horror, not understanding what was happening. Mr. Dupre knew he would not return, but felt relieved that he could save the others. His body gradually disappeared into the darkness, and he felt his soul dissolving into infinity. The portal began to close, and the shadows vanished with it. When the portal finally closed, the tent was once again plunged into silence. The remaining performers gathered together, trying to comprehend what had happened. They knew they had lost Mr. Dupre, but he had saved them at the cost of his life. They decided to leave the circus and this place forever, understanding they could no longer perform after all that had happened. The magic marionette's circus remained abandoned, and no one dared to enter it again. The town of Riverview slowly recovered from the horror, but the memory of what had happened remained with them forever. The legend of Mr. Dupre and his sacrifice was passed down from generation to generation. People told stories of the brave circus director who sacrificed himself to save his friends. Children listened to these stories with awe, and no one dared to approach the abandoned circus. This story served as a warning about the dangers of playing with dark forces and magic. People knew that some things were better left alone to avoid bringing disaster upon themselves. But occasionally, someone would still venture close to the old tent and feel the cold breath of the shadows that remained within. Mr. Dupre remained a legend, but his story became a warning for others. The performers who survived scattered around the world, trying to start new lives. They told tales of those terrifying nights when their circus came alive and turned into a nightmare. These stories became part of their lives, and they could never forget what had happened. And although they never returned to the circus, their hearts were always connected to those dreadful events that forever changed their lives. When the Twilight Dreams circus arrived in the small town of Greenville, all the residents were thrilled. Bright posters featuring cheerful clowns, acrobats, and trained animals adorned every street. Children ran excitedly through the town, telling each other about the acts they wanted to see. But the most attention was drawn to a clown named Smitty, with a huge smile and big, bright eyes. The evening of the first performance gathered nearly all the residents under the big circus tent. The show was captivating, and Smitty quickly became a favorite among the children. However, the town was gripped by horror the very next morning. The first to disappear was little Tommy, a boy from the neighboring street. His parents went to the police, but the search yielded no results. The next day, another child went missing, and the town was engulfed in a panic of fear. Parents tried to keep their children at home, but it didn't help. Every night after darkness fell, another child disappeared. Parents recalled how their children spoke of strange dreams before disappearing, where they saw Smitty. The clown visited them in their dreams, luring them into a mysterious circus they couldn't escape from. The police were powerless, and the residents began to suspect that the circus had something to do with these events. Sheriff Johnson decided to investigate and visited the circus late at night when it was already empty. He searched all the tents but found nothing suspicious. However, as he approached the main tent, he heard a strange laugh. The laugh seemed familiar, but he couldn't understand where it was coming from. The sheriff entered and saw Smitty standing in the middle of the arena, quietly smiling. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, and the sheriff felt a chill of fear. Smitty invited him closer, saying he wanted to show him something special. The sheriff hesitated, but still approached. Suddenly, the clown raised his hand, and the arena filled with children. They were all silent and stood motionless, their eyes empty and soulless. The sheriff tried to approach them, but Smitty stopped him, saying that these children now belonged to him. Johnson realized that these were the missing children. He tried to grab the clown, but Smitty dissolved into the air, leaving only his sinister laugh. The sheriff rushed back to town to warn the residents, but when he returned, he found it was too late. More children had disappeared that night, and their parents were in despair. He told them what he had seen at the circus, but few believed him. People began to think that the sheriff had gone mad from stress. But Johnson knew he had to find a way to stop the clown, or all the children would disappear. He decided to return to the circus that night to find evidence and destroy Smitty once and for all. That night, armed with a flashlight and a gun, he sneaked into the circus. The surroundings were eerily silent, and the shadows from the tents looked even more menacing. The sheriff cautiously approached the main tent and heard the same laugh as before. He entered and saw Smitty waiting for him. The clown invited him to come closer again, but this time Johnson was ready. He pulled out his gun and ordered the clown to stop. But Smitty only laughed, and his laughter grew louder and louder. Suddenly, shadows of the children began to emerge from the darkness, surrounding the sheriff and preventing him from moving. Johnson tried to push through to the clown, but the children were too strong. He felt his strength leaving him and the cold breath of death touching his neck. Smitty came closer, his eyes shining in the darkness, and Johnson knew the end was near. With one last effort, he tried to shoot, but his hand weakened and the gun fell from his grasp. The clown lifted him by the neck and whispered, "Now you belong to me too." The next morning, the town woke up in fear again. Sheriff Johnson had disappeared along with the other children, and no one dared to approach the circus. The residents realized that the clown was a real monster who haunted their dreams and took their children. The circus quickly packed up and left town, leaving behind only eerie silence and fear. People never forgot that night when the Twilight Dreams circus came to their town. And every time a circus appeared somewhere, they remembered the mysterious clown who took the children. Days turned into weeks, and the fear in the town of Greenville only grew. Parents did not allow their children to leave the house after sunset, but that did not stop the nightmares. Every night, the children continued to see Smitty in their dreams, and the clown continued to take them into his sinister circus. Parents began to form groups to patrol the streets and protect their children, but it was all in vain. The clown Smitty was elusive, and his power grew with each disappearance. The residents began to turn to various psychics and priests, but none of them could help. One evening, during another patrol, a group of parents saw a strange light in the sky above the circus arena. They decided to check what was happening and approached closer. The tent was lit from the inside, and they heard music and laughter. Armed with whatever they could find, the parents entered inside. They saw children dancing on the arena to the music, and Smitty controlled them like puppets. The children were in a trance, their faces empty, and only the clown enjoyed his power over them. The parents rushed to the arena, trying to grab their children and stop the clown. But Smitty only laughed and summoned shadows to protect him. The struggle was fierce, and it seemed that nothing could stop the clown. But suddenly, one of the parents found an old spellbook lying on the floor. Desperately searching for a way out, he began to read the spells aloud. The tent began to shake, and the light became brighter. Smitty stopped laughing and started screaming as if something was hurting him. The shadows began to dissipate, and the children gradually came out of the trance. The clown tried to stop the parent, but his power weakened with each word of the spell. The tent shook even more, and it seemed that everything around was about to collapse. The final words of the spell made the clown fall to the ground, his eyes becoming empty and soulless like those of the children he had taken. The light went out, and the tent plunged into darkness. The parents and children ran out of the tent, dragging Smitty, who was no longer moving. They took the clown out of town and buried him in the woods, hoping it would stop his evil powers. Returning home, they began to gradually recover from the experienced horror. The children who returned did not remember anything that had happened, but their parents knew the threat was not over. They decided to destroy the Twilight Dreams circus once and for all, so that no one else would suffer. The residents gathered together and burned all the tents and props, hoping this would end the horrors. But even after that, people felt that something was wrong. At night, they heard distant laughter and saw shadows moving through the town. They knew that the clown Smitty could return at any moment, so they remained vigilant. The town of Greenville never returned to normal life. People always remembered those terrible events and tried to warn others about the danger. And although the Twilight Dreams circus never appeared again, its shadow remained in the hearts of the residents forever. Many years passed, and new generations grew up hearing stories about the mysterious clown. Parents told their children about the danger that could hide behind cheerful masks. And every time a circus appeared somewhere, they remembered Smitty and how he haunted their dreams. They knew not to trust appearances, and that sometimes the scariest monsters could hide behind a clown's smile. Greenville remained a town with a dark secret, and no one ever forgot the horror that the Twilight Dreams circus brought with it.